Right from the start, everything about this loss hits different because nothing about it was just one problem. What unfolded against Dallas was a collapse built on layers, and when you peel each one back, using only the information in your file, the picture becomes even uglier than it looked in real time. And that's why today, instead of sugarcoating anything, we're going straight into what actually happened, what it truly means, and why this moment feels like a gut punch for a team that spent weeks trying to convince everyone they were built to withstand adversity. So come on in, smash that like to support the channel, because from here on out, the conversation gets serious. Before the scoreboard even finished blinking out 21-0, the tone of the night had already shifted. The tape makes that clear. At first, everything flowed. A.J. Brown was cooking early, the offense looked in rhythm, and Jalen Hurts had one of his cleaner starts of the season. But once Dallas adjusted, the Eagles didn't counter. They didn't bend, they stalled. And then they unraveled. But before diving into the collapse, the biggest storyline that came out of this file is the one that changes the entire identity of this defense moving forward, the injury to rookie safety Andrew Mukuba. This is a brutal blow, not only because of how he's been playing lately, but because of how much Vic Fangio had begun to rely on him. And this wasn't an injury born from a big hit by a Cowboys player. It was friendly fire, getting rolled up by Sidney Brown, and it left him unable to put weight on his leg, in crutches, in a boot, and carted off. The reporting points toward a fracture, the possibility of surgery, and the likelihood that his 2025 season is over. And that's painful, because Mukuba wasn't just fine, he was becoming a real piece of this defense. The numbers back it up. Elite pass rush grade, excellent run defense grade, signs of growth and coverage even with rookie mistakes sprinkled in. Fangio trusted him enough to start him next to Reed Blankenship, and that role wasn't handed to him. He earned it. You could see his confidence grow over the last few weeks, and the defense absolutely used him creatively as a blitzer and a disruptor. Now suddenly, on a short week, with the Bears coming up and the NFC standings tightening, the Eagles have to patch together a safety rotation with Michael Carter and Sidney Brown while Reed Blankenship is dealing with a thigh injury of his own. And that's on top of Adoree Jackson being in concussion protocol and a secondary that just gave up nearly 500 yards. Depth is not supposed to be tested this hard in November, but here they are, and this team has no choice but to survive it. And the timing couldn't be worse. Chicago isn't the 0-2 team from September. They're 7-1 since then, riding momentum, and Ben Johnson has that offense humming with Caleb Williams. If you're an Eagles fan expecting an easy rebound game, the reality is the opposite. This Friday suddenly feels like a moment that could swing seeding, confidence, and the trajectory of the last stretch of the season. The Eagles beat the Rams, the Bucs, the Lions, the Packers. They've checked off every major NFC win they needed, but losing to Chicago would erase so much of that ground. And yet, the conversation can't stop at injuries, because this collapse didn't happen because of one player going down. The file makes that extremely clear. The penalties, the offensive line issues, the total disappearance of the run game, these were the true anchors dragging the Eagles into the bottom of the ocean. 14 penalties, 96 yards, and not just penalties, backbreaking, momentum-killing penalties. That is who this team has been all season. Drive after drive wiped out not by the opponent, but by themselves. Explosive gains erased. Field-flipping moments erased. Third and shorts turned into third and longs. A massive downfield throw to DeVonta Smith that should have put the ball at the 12-yard line, gone because of illegal hands to the face. And on the next play, Saquon Barkley fumbles. Mistake, penalty, over and over until the 21-0 lead evaporated. And that brings us to the run game, or whatever you want to call what the Eagles attempted. The file breaks down something fans have been arguing about for weeks. It's not a Saquon Barkley problem. He's not washed. He's not slow. He's not worn out. The offensive line isn't opening lanes at all. Yards before contact? Near the bottom of the league. Against Dallas, it was literally below zero. He was being hit behind the line of scrimmage on average. You can't close out leads when your running back is being met in the backfield before he even secures the ball. You can't stay balanced. You can't eat clock. You can't protect a defense that was running out of gas after a fast start. Yet the passing game was actually working. Hurts threw for 289 with no interceptions. A.J. Brown finished with 110 yards. DeVonta added 89. Production wasn't the issue. The issue was that nothing adjusted once Dallas switched to those five-man fronts, a look the Cowboys have used for multiple weeks. Somehow the Eagles weren't ready, didn't anticipate it, and didn't counter it. And that circles us back to the offensive coordinator question. One Nick Sirianni shut down, according to the file. Kevin Patullo is staying. For now, but Sirianni saying he won't make a change doesn't erase the frustration. He might have called some good plays early, but the inability to adjust swallowed the entire game. The Cowboys shifted, the Eagles didn't. And every slow-developing run, every stalled drive, every penalty magnified the fact that Dallas adapted and Philadelphia didn't. All of this combines into one harsh truth. This wasn't just a loss. It was a mirror held up to everything that has been breaking beneath the surface all season long. And that's where I want to pause this first part, because we still haven't even reached the second half of the breakdown inside the file, which digs even deeper into why the collapse happened and what it means going forward. So let me ask you this as we move into part 2 next. After everything that surfaced from this game, the penalties, the lack of adjustments, the offensive line struggles, the injuries piling up, what concerns you the most right now about this Eagles team? Picking up exactly where we left off, because the collapse in Dallas wasn't just about what the Eagles didn't do, it was also about how every flaw that had been lingering throughout the season finally erupted at the same time, in the worst possible moment, against the worst possible opponent. And the second half of the file makes it even clearer. This wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern finally catching up. The defense started strong. They forced turnovers, they won on fourth down, they flipped early momentum, and they gave the offense every opportunity to bury the Cowboys. But when the offense stopped scoring, and remember, they didn't score a single point for the final 41 minutes, the defense cracked. And it wasn't one big breakdown. It was slow, gradual erosion, missed tackles, fatigue, miscommunication in the secondary, open spaces in the middle of the field, and the Cowboys taking advantage of a defense that was being asked to survive without help. Dak Prescott didn't just put up yards, he put up rhythm. 7 yards per play is not a coincidence. It's a sign of an offense that adjusted faster and more effectively than the Eagles did on either side of the ball. And then there's the number that haunts this game. The Eagles blew a 21-point lead for the first time since 1999, Andy Reid's very first game as head coach. You would think that stat alone would force the coaching staff into a level of self-reflection the public doesn't get to see. Instead, the message we got from the file was the opposite. Sirianni said he isn't making any change at offensive coordinator. That's not just a decision, it's a declaration. It tells you he believes the issues aren't only about play calling, that the root problems run deeper. And honestly, he's not wrong. Because when you break down the patterns in the file, the real story isn't one coach, one player, one moment. It's a stack of systemic issues layered on top of each other until the foundation gave out. The penalties, we've talked about them, but the more you look at the list, the more unbelievable it becomes. These aren't aggressive penalties. They're avoidable ones, procedural ones, focus penalties. And when those penalties wipe away explosive plays, which happened multiple times, it doesn't just hurt the offense, it drains the energy of the entire team. Football is emotional. It's momentum-driven. Every time a big gain gets wiped out, it's like slamming the brakes on a car that finally started picking up speed. And then you look at the offensive line. The very thing this team has been built on for years, dominance in the trenches, is failing right now, and failing in ways that ripple through every phase of the offense. You can't run the ball. You can't stay ahead of the chains. You can't hide your weaknesses. You can't protect a lead. And this is where it gets dangerous. If the offensive line remains this inconsistent, it forces the entire offense into a one-dimensional structure, and that is exactly the kind of environment where mistakes snowball. Which brings us back to adjustments. The Cowboys switched into those 5-man fronts because they knew the Eagles' interior was struggling. They forced matchups. They forced confusion. They forced instability. And once the Eagles couldn't match that adjustment, everything stalled. That's not only a schematic failure, it's an emotional one. Players begin to feel like they're reacting instead of dictating, like they're hanging on instead of attacking. And when that happens, the confidence in the system cracks. You could feel that shift in the file's descriptions, the urgency rising, the mistakes piling up, the rhythm disappearing completely. And yet, the most worrying part isn't the collapse itself. It's that the collapse exposed things that can't be fixed in 1 week. The penalties require discipline. The run game requires blocking chemistry. The injuries require time. The adjustments require trust in the coaching staff. These are big problems, not temporary ones. Which takes us to the Bears game, a game that suddenly carries enormous weight. Chicago isn't the team they were in September. Caleb Williams is comfortable. Ben Johnson is dialing up concepts that stress secondaries, and the Eagles' secondary is battered, hurt, patchwork, and now missing a rookie who is becoming a stabilizing force. This game could absolutely decide whether the Eagles keep control of their seeding or whether the final month turns into a sprint filled with pressure and scoreboard watching. And let's be real, This fan base has seen enough late-season drama to last a lifetime. So now the question becomes, where do they go from here? Because the second half of the file makes something very clear. This wasn't about effort. It wasn't about toughness. It was about execution, discipline, adjustments, and identity. And if the Eagles want to steady themselves and make the kind of run this roster was built for, they have to confront those issues head-on. Not with slogans. Not with "we'll clean it up." With actual changes in how they play and how they respond when opponents push back. So let me leave you with this as we close the second half of this story. After everything this team showed, good and bad, do you believe the Eagles can fix these issues in time for the final stretch? Or do you think this collapse was the warning sign we couldn't afford to ignore? And if you're still here, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, drop a like to help push this video to more Eagles fans, and check out the videos popping up on your screen now, and let me know your thoughts below. What makes this moment so unsettling for the fan base isn't just the collapse itself, it's the sense that this team has reached a crossroads where every decision, every adjustment, every slip in discipline now has magnified consequences. And the reality inside the file is that the Eagles didn't just lose a game, they lost control. Control of momentum. Control of execution, control of the traits that defined last year's run. The irony is that even in this loss, even in this unraveling, the raw talent is still there. You saw flashes. You saw A.J. Brown winning his matchups. You saw DeVonta creating separation. You saw the defense forcing turnovers early, making fourth down stops, giving this offense every chance to break the Cowboys back. And that's what makes all of this so frustrating for the fan base. The ingredients are there, but the recipe keeps coming out wrong. And that's where leadership comes into the spotlight, because the file makes clear that Nick Sirianni isn't budging on Kevin Patullo. He isn't making a dramatic shakeup. Whether you agree with that or not, it tells us one thing. This coaching staff believes the problems aren't rooted in one person or one job title. They believe these issues are broader, and in some ways, that's even harder to fix. It's easier to fire a coordinator than it is to repair discipline. It's easier to swap play callers than it is to rebuild confidence on a struggling offensive line. It's easier to bench someone than it is to teach an entire offense how to handle defensive adjustments mid-game. And yet, that's exactly the mountain they now have to climb. And what makes the timing even heavier is that the file ends with a reality fans don't want to hear but can't avoid. They aren't going back-to-back unless these issues get fixed. Not improved. Fixed. Because the NFC isn't waiting. The Cowboys aren't waiting. The Bears aren't waiting. The Rams aren't waiting. Every team chasing them is getting sharper while the Eagles are leaking oil. So the perspective now becomes this. Maybe this collapse was necessary. Maybe it was the punch in the mouth they've been dodging all season. Maybe it forces accountability in places where excuses were starting to feel too comfortable. Maybe it shakes the locker room awake. Or maybe it's the start of a slide no one wants to admit is possible. And that's the heart of the conversation now. Which version of this team responds? The one that built leads on physicality, precision, and control? Or the one that gave away a 21-point cushion for the first time since 1999? Because the Bears don't care. The rest of the NFC doesn't care. And the clock is ticking. So now I'll turn it back to you, the fans watching. After everything revealed in the file, everything exposed on that field, and everything that lies ahead. Because what happens next for the Eagles isn't about hype, or slogans, or wishing things into place. It's about whether this team can respond when their flaws have finally been exposed in full daylight. And that's the pulse running through everything inside your file. The Eagles aren't broken, but they've reached a point where their margin for error has officially disappeared. And nothing shows that more clearly than the way this team has been living on the edge all season. Winning ugly is still winning, until the dam breaks. You can survive penalties for a while. You can survive a limited run game for a while. You can survive inconsistent offensive rhythm for a while. You can even survive defensive lapses when your playmakers bail you out. But you can't survive all of it at once, and that's exactly what happened against Dallas. This wasn't a game where one thing cost them. It was every weakness, stacked on top of each other, under the brightest lights, in the most emotional rivalry, at the moment where they needed to look like a top seed, and instead looked like a team searching for answers. And that's what takes us into the bigger picture. What does this mean for the locker room? Because the file makes something crystal clear. The players aren't pointing fingers at the coaches. They're pointing at themselves. The penalties, the procedural mistakes, the missed assignments, those aren't on Kevin Patullo. Those aren't on Sirianni. Those are on the players on the field. And when you see veterans committing them, when you see drive-killing mistakes from multiple position groups, that's when the leadership group inside the locker room becomes the difference between a correction and a collapse. This team has leaders. Hurts, Kelsey, even if his play hasn't been what it used to be, his voice still matters. A.J. Brown, Darius Slay, Fletcher Cox. But leadership only matters if the players around them respond to it. And right now, After a loss like that, this becomes the moment where the room decides whether to tighten or fracture. And the toughest pill for fans, and probably for the locker room too, is knowing that Dallas didn't beat the Eagles with trickery or something exotic. They beat them by doing something the file highlights repeatedly: adjusting. They tweaked their fronts. They changed their spacing. They altered their pass rush. They identified matchups. And every time they did, the Eagles froze. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the confusion up front, it was all there on tape, which is what makes the upcoming week so critical, because you don't get to ease back into rhythm against Chicago. Not with Caleb Williams playing free and confident. Not with Ben Johnson calling games like he's auditioning for his next job. And not with your secondary banged up and missing Andrew Mukuba, a rookie who is becoming one of Vic Fangio's most trusted pieces. On a short week, injured, frustrated, under pressure, this is where you find out whether the Eagles were just punched in the mouth or whether they're bleeding. Because here's the truth your file keeps circling around. This season isn't about talent. The talent is there. The roster is there. The ceiling is still there. It's about execution, detail, poise, the master things that take no talent, stuff that Nick Sirianni loves to preach, and that this team, right now, is not mastering. So now the question becomes even sharper. Was this collapse the wake-up call they needed, or the first sign that deeper issues are finally surfacing at the worst possible time? And that's where I'll leave you, because the next move, the next response, and the next performance will say more about this team than the entire first half of the season combined. Because now we arrive at the part of this story fans don't like talking about, but absolutely need to confront. This collapse didn't happen in isolation. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of weeks, maybe months, of cracks forming beneath the surface, all hitting at once under the brightest spotlight of the season. And that's the part of the file that hits hardest. The idea that the Eagles have been surviving, not thriving. They've been winning close games not because the offense found its groove, but because the defense carried them. Not because the run game controlled the clock, but because the passing game produced just enough moments. Not because the team eliminated mistakes, but because their talent was enough to outlast them. But eventually, playing that kind of football guarantees one thing: the moment you stop getting those breaks, the bottom